Good morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for your ongoing support. If you are enjoying these webinars, which we're providing for free as a public service, and you would like to join us in the effort to keep all of these live streams going, we've just launched a new platform that makes giving easier than ever before. So please stay tuned for a brief information at the end of this program to show how you can continue to pledge your support. We have a terrific lineup for you through the summer and on into the fall, including a new 2020 presidential series that begins September 8th and continues up through the election. So if that's of interest, please go to our website at lawac.org and register today. It's now my pleasure to introduce our politics professor, Dan Schnur, in his weekly series, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Today, Dan's three topics, hi Dan, will include China. Will China win the 2020 presidential election? Is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez the future of American politics? And of course, your favorite, the morning headlines, news from the front page. Dan, I can't wait for this conversation. We should say to the audience, we have such a great following. I think most of them know how to submit their questions, but there's a panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions for Dan. Claire Krelitz, our communications manager, will be managing the questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. And we, as always, try to get to as many of the questions you have for Dan as possible. So Dan, without further ado, I'll turn this over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kim. And maybe that was a little bit more ado than was necessary, but let's definitely get started. And I'll go through my three topics in the first portion of the program, as we always do, and then try to leave as much time for all of your questions as possible. And as Kim mentioned, just so that no one is shocked in about 20 minutes, our amazing Jessica Duganzik is off this week, taking a well-deserved week with her family. And so Claire Krelitz, who you normally benefit from Claire's work, but don't get to see and hear her, she'll be stepping in. And of course, our own Christina Shabanava will be helping us with our questions today. So thanks in advance to Claire and Christina for stepping up in Jessica's absence. All right, so let's talk about China. And as I think most of you may have seen, the headline for this program has been changed a little bit since last week. And I would now suggest the best way to think about this is not will China win the 2020 election here in the United States, but rather why China will win the 2020 election. And I'm going to take a couple minutes to explain my thinking there. First of all, let's agree that one of the most challenging things about the US relationship with China is the very large number of potential areas of conflict between the two countries in terms of economically, human rights, military, national security issues. There's no shortage of potential areas of conflict. And so before we go any further, maybe what we can do is, Christina, if you're willing to help me, maybe we can start by getting your thoughts on what you think our country's top priorities should be when dealing with China. And Christina has given us 5 options to choose from, and we're limited by technology to just those 5. There certainly are more, but I'd ask you to let us know that should our country's leaders, both current and future, what should they prioritize in our relationships with the People's Republic of China and its leaders? Should they focus on democracy in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and in other places in that region? Should they concentrate on the treatment of Muslim communities, particularly in the northwest part of China? Should they be thinking about access to the South China Sea and other security-related questions? Should they be focusing on international trade and other economic matters? Or should the primary area of discussion between our two countries be COVID-19, either its origins and/or the types of remedies that our countries and others should work on collectively to confront that challenge? So Christina, let's see what our participants had to say. Boy, look at that. 57% say that the most important area on which our leaders should be focusing is international trade and I'm presuming other related economic issues with China. That's very, very interesting. 15% says the South China Sea, and I'll interpret from that other military and security questions. 14% talk about democracy in Hong Kong, as well as other challenges within the nation. 7% talk about the treatment of Muslim communities, and 7% also think COVID-19 ought to be the primary focus. So obviously there's a lot going on between the two countries. And what I would posit as we move this conversation forward is, regardless of whether this or our next president focuses on any of the issues that you've outlined or others, the broader political landscape, at least in this country, as it relates to China, has changed dramatically. When you watch the news out of Washington, it seems like the Democrats and Republicans can't agree on anything. Not on COVID, not on police reform, not on race relations, not on immigration or taxes or climate change. But there is one issue on which there is a very strong emerging bipartisan consensus, an issue on which the two parties do agree. And in America in 2020, that emerging bipartisan consensus can be simply put as both sides agree that China is bad. And whether they would make their case on economic or security or human rights issues, a growing number of our elected representatives in Congress in both parties are adopting an increasingly suspicious and increasingly antagonistic attitude toward our relationship with the People's Republic of China and its leaders. Now, as the members of this organization know, this attitude is new, at least in these numbers, in the size and scope. Because for almost half a century, ever since Richard Nixon first traveled to Beijing and Shanghai back in 1972, the consensus in Washington among the leaders in both parties was that economic engagement with China would gradually lead that country toward an embrace of democratic values. And what I would tell you is, I believe at least, that consensus by 2016, that consensus had largely crumbled. And both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders used the issue to inflame populist passions from the bases of both of their respective parties over the course of the campaign. So long before the pandemic, there was, as I said a moment ago, growing antagonism in both parties toward China's leaders on this whole range of issues. Now, it's become clear to our leaders and to most of us for some time, the president, Xi Jinping of China, is very comfortable accompanying global economic outreach with more intense domestic political repression and international military confrontation. So that supposition through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the first years of the 21st century is one that the Chinese government had not necessarily adhered to. Economic engagement was not leading to the embrace of democratic values. And although these points did not raise as much concern with all of you as the economic and trade questions, I think it is worth noting that the Chinese government's continued crackdown in Hong Kong, their increasingly confrontational attitude in Taiwan, their aggression in the South China Sea, their combative behavior on trade and monetary policy, and their mistreatment of Muslim minority populations in Northwest China have led to an unprecedented level of criticism, even from confirmed globalists like me. It's one thing for isolationists to talk about in more belligerent terms about the US relationship with China. But we're seeing internationalists, both here in the US and in other countries around the world, becoming increasingly skeptical about how to approach China. So maybe, Christina, we can put up our second question and get some guidance from our participants on how they think our country's leaders should approach our relationships with China. And this is a pretty binary question we're putting to you, and I realize it's a little bit unfair to force you into one corner or the other. But at the risk of oversimplifying a very complicated question, do you think our government's leaders should be more aggressive in their dealings with China or more conciliatory? And Christina, when you have the answers, let's see what our participants have to say on this question. Well, this is a little bit closer than the first one. And I suspect it's a different answer than we might have gotten even a year ago. 58%, well more than half, a very strong majority of our participants believe the US should be more aggressive in our relationship with China. And only 42% say a more conciliatory relationship. And once again, this really flies in the face of the way leaders in both parties have thought about our relationship with that country for many, many years. Now, for Donald Trump's first 3 years in office, his nationalistic tendencies on this and other issues were balanced by his hunger for a bilateral trade agreement with China. But it's very clear that the coronavirus has convinced him that the trade deals that he pursued with Xi are not nearly as valuable to him politically as the benefits of attacking the Chinese government for its role in spreading the pandemic. So both the Trump administration and the Trump re-election campaign have moved very aggressively to depict China as a hostile threat, and they are heightening its use as a weapon against Joe Biden. Now, Biden isn't a bad target for them on this. He was first elected to the Senate only a few months after Nixon traveled to China back in 1972. And since then, he has reflected the prevailing Washington belief under both Democratic and Republican presidents in the mutual benefits of strengthening the ties between the two countries. So over the last half a century, there's no shortage of quotes and video of Biden saying very nice things about the Chinese government and its leaders. But Trump has some history here too. His pursuit of the trade agreement and his ongoing admiration for authoritarian leaders means that there are quite a few of his quotes for the Democrats to use against him in their TV ads. So my prediction is, and I don't like to make predictions as all of you know, but I will here, my prediction is that both campaigns will spend huge amounts of time and energy and invective this fall to paint their opponents as soft on China. Now, more and more members of Congress in both parties are jumping on this issue too. So this approach, this attitude is going to continue well beyond Election Day. Now, the Chinese leaders, President Xi and his colleagues, they see and hear all of this, but they also understand the increasing isolationist trends in American politics, which we've talked about on this webinar many times in the past. And Xi believes that most voters in this country have little appetite for a prolonged US presence in East Asia. And so his diplomatic, economic, and military aggression will continue and will intensify, as well as his crackdown on democracy and human rights, because he knows that the angry language from US leaders in both parties is probably not going to lead to anything more than tough talk. Now, as we've talked about before, America's always turned inward after wars and economic downturns. And this country's voters are not going to want their next president to engage in China in an impactful way, not after dealing with a recession, with the COVID crisis, with the heightened state of racial discussions in this country. There's a lot going on to encourage Americans to want to turn inward. And so to sum this all up, in this election, the soft on China debate between Biden and Trump might be settled by who has the loudest and angriest arguments against China. So the loudest anti-China voice might win the White House in November, but once the shouting is over, it looks like President Xi could end up being our election's biggest winner, because he knows the next president, either Biden or Trump, is not going to be in a position at home to engage as forcefully as they might like. Okay, let's go on to our second topic now. And this topic, which we picked out, admittedly to be just a little bit provocative, is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez the future of American politics? And so let me explain why we picked this title and why we picked this topic. Most of you have heard over the course of the last few months, Joe Biden refer to himself as a bridge to the next generation of political leaders. So let's talk about that next generation. Now, 2 years ago, a 28-year-old former bartender from New York City by the name of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez pulled off one of the biggest political upsets in recent memory, winning a Democratic primary by defeating the fourth-ranking Democrat in the House leadership in a contested primary. Now, former Representative Joe Crowley is not nearly as well known as those three Democrats who were ahead of him, Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and Jim Clyburn. But many people in Washington and elsewhere saw Crowley as an heir to Democratic leadership, to Democratic leadership when Pelosi and Hoyer decided to move on to other things. And so his defeat was at the hands of someone with no political experience. We all remember how shocking that was. Now, since then, AOC has become one of the most visible, and I'd argue one of the most influential politicians in the country. She has by far the biggest social media following in Congress, bigger than Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and Charles Schumer combined. In fact, the only political leaders in the world who have more Twitter followers than Ocasio-Cortez are Donald Trump, Barack Obama, and the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi. Now, this is obviously about a lot more than Twitter or Instagram. AOC is also one of the most progressive voices in the Democratic Party. And she's working very hard and has worked very hard in a number of ways to move the party to the left over the course of her time in Congress. But it is worth noting that her ascension, it's not an individual dynamic. AOC's rise reflects a much broader demographic and ideological shift within the Democratic Party. Just this week, we saw Representative William Clay of Missouri lose a primary challenge to a younger and more progressive opponent, Cori Bush. Eliot Engel, the longtime congressman from New York and chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, lost his primary to a younger and more progressive challenger, Jamal Bowman. Daniel Lipinski lost his primary in Illinois. And just 2 years ago, we may remember that another member of the so-called squad, Representative Ayanna Pressley, won her seat by beating a 10-term incumbent in Massachusetts. Now, this is not unique to the Democrats. Young Republicans have upset their elders in the past, and just this year, we've seen 2 Republican incumbents lose in their own primaries. But focusing this back on the Democratic Party, we know that America's future is younger by definition, of course, more demographically diverse, according to the census, and more ideologically liberal, at least according to most public opinion polling, who have noted that millennials and Generation Z tend to lean much further left on most matters of public policy, domestic and international, than older voters. We know that the Democratic Party, like the country, is becoming more multicultural. What we need to discuss, what I'm interested in hearing from you on, is as the Democratic Party becomes more demographically diverse, will they continue to head leftward ideologically? In 2018, just 2 years ago, Nancy Pelosi ran more centrist candidates, and those candidates helped her take back control of the House of Representatives. This year, a centrist in Biden is at the top of the ticket, but down ballot races like the ones we've just talked about seem to indicate a longer term move leftward for the Democratic Party. So the question for all of you is that a good or a bad thing? What do you think? And Christina, can we put up the third question? How should the Democrats position themselves for the fall elections? And note that this is a question specifically about the fall campaigns, less than 90 days until the election. Should the Democrats, one, emphasize liberal and progressive goals to motivate their party base to turn out, particularly young people and voters from communities of color? Or alternatively, should the Democrats campaign on more center-left issues to reach undecided voters as they did in 2018? Let's see what the sentiment is here, Christina. Let's put up the numbers. Wow, look at that. 21%, a little bit less than 1/4, say to emphasize liberal progressive goals to motivate the party base. 79%, more than 3/4, say follow the Biden approach, follow the 2018 Pelosi approach, and campaign on center-left issues to reach undecided voters. Next week, we're going to come back to this question, this topic, in a slightly different context, We're going to ask you to think about it not just in the context of this year's campaign, but more broadly, what course the Democratic Party should take going forward. But at least as it relates to the 2020 elections, our participants, Christine, I think you'd agree, are pretty decided that winning over those undecided voters in the center should be the Democrats' top priority. And so while that may for this year mean a slightly less visible role for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I'd be willing to bet that in the long term, the party does continue to head in her direction, both demographically and ideologically. Finally, and we're going to open it up to your questions and comments in just a second, and I'll ask Claire to join me, is our topic of the day, our headlines from this morning. And what struck me in reading the news this morning from the campaign trail is the state of our national political conventions. Now, where are the conventions going to happen? Now, the short version, as we've known for some time, is the conventions are going to happen online. The Democrats decided many, many months ago that while they might have some presence in my hometown of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for the most part, their convention was going to take place online, digitally, from across the country. And while President Trump and his advisors, in my opinion, denied the inevitable for many months, moving the convention site from North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, they too more recently recognized that they wouldn't be able to have the type of large gathering that the president had been hoping for. So what we learned yesterday is a couple of things as it related to the conventions. First of all, the Democrats announced that Vice President Biden would not be traveling to Milwaukee to make his announcement speech, and in fact would give his speech accepting his party's nomination via remote, presumably from his home in Delaware. So even a convention that was going to take place primarily online looks like that's going to be the case even more so, primarily if not exclusively, because of increased concerns about the spread of the COVID-19 virus, of course. We've also learned over the last couple of days that President Trump, knowing that he cannot give that acceptance speech for his party in North Carolina or in Florida, is now considering giving that speech on the south lawn of the White House, which has raised all sorts of consternation, not just from Democrats, but from any number of Republicans as well, who are concerned that this violates the separation between government activity and political activity that generally leaves the White House out of bounds for most campaign-related functions. So we will see if other Republicans are able to convince the president that holding his acceptance speech on the White House grounds is inappropriate, or whether he will, as he has so many times in the past, violate protocols and go ahead with it otherwise. One other thing I'll mention from the campaign trail, there was a headline in the Politico yesterday, a fascinating story that they ran about the party's ground games. And this relates to the point we were just discussing about the conventions, because it's based in concerns about the COVID-19 virus on the 2020 election. The headline in Politico read as follows. It said, Trump campaign knocks on 1 million doors a week. Biden's knocks on 0. Now, before the Democrats in our group get too alarmed, the article makes it very clear that both strategies are entirely intentional. The Trump campaign has decided, reflecting Republican sentiment, that the virus is not as menacing, not as much of a threat as other voters. They've decided that knocking on doors, the way candidates and volunteers have always done in the past, is an activity worth engaging in this year, because we know from research and study that personal face-to-face contact is the best way to convince a voter to support your candidate or your cause. Now, of course, the challenge on that is the term face-to-face. And the Biden campaign has made the equally purposeful decision that they're not going to do any in-person, door-to-door, face-to-face campaigning this year because of concerns about the spread of the virus. So the Biden campaign believes that as desirable as face-to-face campaigning is under most circumstances, that in an era of coronavirus, that most voters would rather communicate with the campaign by phone, by text, and through other virtual means, rather than risking potential further spread of COVID. So as the next 80 some days plays out, we'll see which of these strategies is right. Was the Trump campaign correct in taking the gamble in order to engage in person-to-person, face-to-face campaigning? Or did Vice President Biden and his campaign make the right decision by deciding to be more careful, foregoing perhaps an opportunity to more directly engage with voters in order to reassure them that they share the concern about the spread of the pandemic? So it's entirely intentional. Two different strategies based on targeting of two different groups of voters. Like so many other things we talk about in this webinar each week, we'll see what happens in the weeks ahead. So with that, I want to welcome Claire Krelitz. And you guys, as I said earlier, have all been beneficiaries of Claire's work since she ascended into the role of communications director and even before that. But this is the first time, at least for me, that I get to work with her on screen. So Claire, do we have questions from our audience that between you and I we can try to answer?
We have tons of questions, and it's good to be here with everybody today as Jessica is enjoying some time off. We have a lot of questions on China, so let's dive back there and start with, why do you think that major US Navy activity in the South China Sea has received so little media attention? Do you think there is a possibility of confrontation there? And what is current US policy and thinking there in the South China Sea?
Boy, it's a great question. And I'll point out that not only, as the questioner references, is the public not paying a lot of attention to the Chinese presence in the South China Sea, but it appears, going back to the questions that we put up earlier, Claire, our own participants don't prioritize that as an issue, at least not to the degree that they do economic and trade matters. So why are so many people not paying attention to this? And I suspect it's because a potential military engagement before it happens in any part of the world is an abstraction. So most Americans know intuitively that there are a lot of bad actors around the planet. And they know that there's the potential for conflict, and they know that there's usually conflict going on somewhere in the world at any time, at every moment. And so until there's more of a flare up there in the South China Sea that involves the US, I think it becomes a little bit easier for American voters not to pay much attention to it. And the smaller scale provocations between the US and China don't quite rise to the level of concern that would allow most voters to focus their attention on the matter. Now, that said, as most of the people in this webinar know, this is a critically important issue. We know that even though the Chinese military is only one fraction the size of the US, more and more military analysts, independent of the Defense Department and of the government, are concluding that as China's military buildup continues, that its presence and its reach and its force on the Pacific Rim has now matched, if not exceeded, that of the US. And in fact, were there to be a military conflict in that part of the world, there are a growing number of people who are concerned that the US might not be able to prevail. Now, going back to what I was saying earlier about the Chinese government leaders' suspicion, and I would say growing confidence as to the isolationist tendencies of the American people, Xi and his colleagues, I think, are pretty confident that the US is not going to go to war with China over the type of disputes that China is having with Vietnam, with Korea, with other countries in that part of the world. So the challenge for an American president in Congress, be it Trump or Biden and the members of the House and Senate, is how to push back at China with warnings in a way that are to be taken seriously, even given the fact that it's unlikely that the US populace has an appetite for more direct military engagement. The current administration has increased the US presence in that area and increased its show of, I don't want to say a show of force because they have not engaged militarily, but by sending battleships, by sending large military vessels through the South China Sea as a warning to China. They're essentially saying, we do take this seriously. We're not ignoring what's going on here, But the question of what the US would do if China were to call our bluff is going to be one of the most important questions that the next president of the United States faces.
Yeah, and I think that kind of gets into this next question, which is, can you give an example of an aggressive action that would be effective that the US could take to China?
Well, that's the critically important question. What can the United States do short of direct military engagement that could convince the Chinese to be more restrained? Some of that is already taking place. As I mentioned a moment ago, an increased presence of US military in the region. And I suspect that either President Trump or President Biden would continue to escalate on that front, not toward direct military engagement, of course, but sending our vessels into the South China Sea and keeping them there for longer periods of time. The challenge for an administration of either party is beyond that. There's really not much that can be done, at least from a security standpoint, directly, proactively. In other words, it almost by definition requires a Chinese provocation for the US to choose to escalate on its own. The two things that can be done, or the two areas in which more can be done, one is economically, and that gets into a conversation about trade and protectionism, which we've had here before, and I know we will again in the future. But the other, and to me the most important steps that the US can be taking are not militarily, not economically, but diplomatically. And it's very clear that our relationships with other countries in that region, those feeling most threatened by a more assertive Chinese presence, simply no longer trust the United States to be reliable allies on that front. Now, it's a little bit artificial to separate out diplomatic activity from military and economic action because they are interwoven. But I think in order to convince China that these continued provocations against the Vietnamese, against the Japanese, against the Taiwanese, against others cannot stand, is in addition to that increased US military presence in the region. I think even the stronger and more important message would be sent through renewed and strengthened diplomatic ties with other countries in that part of the world.
Great. So you talked a little bit about how the trade deal is not super politically, not as politically beneficial for Trump anymore, but this person is wondering, what is the state of the trade deal? Has Trump's China policy totally failed? Where is that at right now?
The trade agreements that the Trump administration has forged with China are at this point at best on life support, and there's no question that the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic has created all sorts of additional problems in the relationship, both directly in terms of diplomatic relationships and more broadly in terms of mutual suspicions and mutual accusations about the spread of the virus. But even before COVID, it looked like trade between China and the US was in a very precarious place. Trump has invested a great deal of time and effort into developing a relationship with Xi. And because, among other things, Trump understands that China represents one of, if not the largest market for US agricultural exports. And there are both economic and electoral reasons why farmers in California, in the Midwest, and in other parts of the country, particularly those farmers in swing states, why their economic interests are of interest to the president politically. So we weren't in a great place in terms of furthering trade relationships with China before the pandemic. But as is the case with our relationship in so many other areas, over the last 4.5, 5 months, the spread of the coronavirus has had a destructive effect, not just on world health, but certainly on the relationship between the US and China. And so a pronounced resuscitation effort is going to be necessary come January, regardless of who takes the oath of office on January 20th.
So on that note, who would be better on China, Biden or Trump?
Boy, that's a totally unfair question. Thanks a lot, Claire. Who would be better on China, Biden or Trump? And the answer I'll give you, and it sounds like I'm evading, but I'm not, is it depends. More specifically, it depends on what you want the U.S. relationship with China to be. In other words, if you want to see a relationship that becomes more confrontational, as the majority of our respondents suggested in our poll question, in our survey question a little bit earlier, if you do think that the U.S. should be more confrontational than it has been in the past, then Trump is more likely to pursue that path going forward. If you do believe that the way both parties have approached this relationship for many years, going back to Richard Nixon, the way both parties have approached this relationship since the 1970s, Biden is more likely to follow that path. Now, it's not quite that black and white. I believe that Biden would be more conciliatory and more willing to look for common ground. But he, like most other political leaders of both parties in Washington, now views China with much greater suspicion than he may have even during his time as vice president, 4 or 5 years ago. But I think who would be better depends on how you define better. If better means pushing harder in a Trump-Sanders way, pushing back at China more aggressively, then Trump is the one to do that. If you're looking for more of an effort toward conciliation, then I think Biden, historically and dispositionally, is more likely to pull that off. So how's that for a non-answer, Claire?
That's a perfect non-answer, but gives a lot to think about, which is what we want here. So this is a fun one. How scared are Democrats of AOC?
How scared are Democrats of AOC? Well, and once again, I've found my perfect way to avoid tough questions is it depends. It depends on which Democrats you're talking about. If you are a Democrat who is more centrist, who believes that the party wins elections, as the majority of the respondents to our survey did a little bit earlier, if you believe that the path to victory goes through the political center, as it did for the Democrats in 2018, then fear of AOC is probably a little bit overstated. But how about great concern that as the next generation of party leaders moves the party to the left, that it may in some ways end up ceding the political center to the Republicans. On the flip side, we know, and we've talked about this on the webinar many times before, a campaign, in order to be successful, has to both motivate its base and persuade undecided voters. And so for the party base, for progressives, for young people, for voters from minority communities whose participation is absolutely critical for Joe Biden to win in November and for other Democrats to be successful going forward, the Democratic voters who represent that base, they're not scared of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They're excited by her. They're inspired by her, and they will follow her. And they will follow her in great numbers. So, in a two-party system like we have, as opposed to a multiple-party system that exists in so many other countries around the world, there's always going to be divisions within the party. And in the weeks ahead, we'll talk about the divisions within the Republican Party. Not between moderates and conservatives, because there just really aren't that many Republican moderates left anymore, but from what I'd call traditional conservatives and Trump conservatives. And so when you have two parties, you have much more visible factions in both. Are some Democrats worried about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, not just personally, but the move to the left that her ascension may represent? Of course. The question that we don't know the answer to is whether the number of Democrats who are concerned about AOC and where she wants to take the party, whether they are outnumbered by or whether they outnumber the younger, more diverse cohort of Democrats who think this is the ticket to the party's success in the future. We don't know.
Great, thank you. So what about this next question, which this person says, with many polls consistently showing widespread national support for progressive policies such as Medicare for all, and the widespread disillusionment with the current centrist regime, wouldn't it be better to move the Democratic Party towards a more progressive direction to appeal to undecided voters?
Well, and of course, this is the flip side to the previous question. Ultimately, a party needs to do both. Ultimately, though, every candidate, every campaign has to decide which is more important. Is it both based motivation for persuading undecideds? And the questioner makes a reasonable point. Any number of smart people have looked back at Hillary Clinton's defeat in 2016 and pointed to the decreased turnout among young people and voters from minority communities as a reason for her defeat. My own personal opinion, I don't like to take sides on this, is that in both parties, ultimately persuading those undecideds is the way you get over 50% of the vote. But you can't do that without a motivated base. So the questioner is raising exactly the right point. And if I can rephrase it, if the question for Biden and his successors to consider is, how do you reach out to undecided voters without demotivating your most loyal supporters? How can you do both? The Biden campaign believes that Donald Trump does that for them, that Trump's presence unites centrists and base progressives. But going forward, this is the most important question both of the two parties face, and whether this becomes an AOC party, not just generationally and not just demographically, but ideologically, whether it becomes an AOC party or not, defines two very, very different Democratic parties going forward.
So that begs the question, why isn't there a Republican AOC?
Why isn't there a Republican AOC? I'll give you two answers to that. One, you generally don't see someone take on a role like this one when their own party controls the White House. Imagine if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had been elected to Congress when Barack Obama was president. She'd be just as progressive as she is now. She'd be just as smart and just as savvy and just as inspirational as she is now. But there'd be less motivation for many of her supporters to devote as much time and energy to supporting her causes under a president of the same party as under a Republican. So I think some of it just is timing, that AOC was elected at a time of particular urgency for the Democratic Party, i.e. when there was a Republican president, and that had she been elected when there was a Democrat, she'd still be a formidable force, but certainly not to the same degree. So that said, why aren't there Republican AOCs? And the answer, as I said earlier, is we're not going to find them under Trump, but under Democratic presidents, I suspect you will, and in fact would. If you look back in the past, you could argue that the Freedom Caucus and the Tea Party during Barack Obama's presidency produced any number of young conservative versions of AOC. You can go back to Bill Clinton's presidency in the 1990s and argue that young upstart Newt Gingrich represented the same thing to an emerging generation of conservative Republicans that AOC now represents to this up-and-coming generation of progressive Democrats. And again, although I hate predictions, as all of you know, I will make you this one. If Joe Biden is elected president in November or December, as the case may be, keep an eye on a woman from Colorado, a woman by the name of Lauren Boebert. And Lauren Boebert is a very conservative Republican gun activist who won a contested primary against an incumbent member of Congress. She beat an incumbent congressman, a conservative, more of a traditional conservative, a guy by the name of Scott Tipton, in Colorado's primary earlier this year. And in all likelihood will go on to represent that district in the House of Representatives. She's not quite as young as AOC, but I suspect that if there is a Democratic president, you'll see the Republican Party make an effort to elevate her into an Ocasio-Cortez-ish role in opposition to a Democratic president, the same way the original rose in opposition to a Republican in the White House.
So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, but when kind of on this topic, when Donald Trump was elected, we saw Republican leaders unite around their president. Right now, we're seeing the same with Joe Biden. Democratic leaders, AOC, Bernie Sanders are supporting Biden. If Biden were to get elected, and I know you're not predicting whether he will, do you expect to see the same kind of consolidation of the Democratic Party and unity, or do you think because of AOC, who's pushing the party farther, we might not see the same thing?
Well, it's Claire, it's difficult to see President Biden being able to maintain the same level of control over the Democratic Party, at least in Congress, as Trump has with Republicans. And it's for a couple of reasons. One, the Democrats just inherently are less willing to, well, the way Bill Clinton put it is Bill Clinton years ago once said, he said, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. And so just structurally, Republicans, for all sorts of psychopolitical reasons that we don't have time or I don't have the qualifications to get into today, for all sorts of broader sort of philosophical differences between the two parties, Republicans generally tend to be more hierarchical in the way they approach these things. And Democrats, it's a famous line that now goes back more than a century, Will Rogers famously saying, I don't belong to an organized party, I'm a Democrat. And that is overstated. The Democrats can organize very effectively when necessary, as they appear to be doing this fall. But I suspect that if President Biden is sworn in January, while there'll be an original burst of enthusiasm from his party in Congress simply to have control over Washington back on their side, I don't know how long that unity will last for all the reasons we were talking about a moment ago. The other thing that's going on, and this is not a criticism of Biden or of Trump, is one of the best ways to maintain loyalty in politics is fear. And Donald Trump has successfully found a way to employ his grassroots support among conservatives to frighten Republicans, elected officials, into sticking with him. Biden has referred to himself, as I mentioned earlier, as a bridge to a next generation. And so that doesn't mean he can't be an effective president. In fact, he would probably be a very effective president. But it's unlikely that a self-described transitional figure is going to command that kind of loyalty as a movement leader would. Again, that's not taking sides on behalf of either. But I think the dynamics we've been talking about suggest that a President Biden would have more challenges with his own party in Congress than President Trump has.
Great. Do you think that all states will participate in mail-in voting despite the objections of Trump?
Trump is some of you may have seen, Trump is beginning to weaken on his opposition to mail-in voting. As we've talked about in previous webinars, when the president talks about the vulnerability of mail-in voting to fraud, his statements have been met with great concern by Republican Party leaders, Republican senators, Republican governors, state party officials who know that they need to rely on a robust mail turnout for their most loyal supporters in November, have been getting very, very concerned because the more Trump warns about the dangers of it, the more it looks as though many conservative voters simply won't turn out. And in any number of primaries over the last few months, we've seen Republican turnout down, particularly as it relates to mail voting. So earlier this week, the president said he thought that mail voting would be all right in Florida, and praised the Republican governor Ron DeSantis there for his work. Just yesterday, I believe, Trump said that mail voting would be okay and acceptable in Arizona, and praised the Republican governor Doug Ducey there for overseeing a smart system on this. So on one hand, Republican activists know that they need to turn out their voters by mail those voters, particularly older voters who aren't going to vote in person, who are more concerned about voting in person. And so that's why you're seeing Trump beginning to soften his language, albeit in a somewhat selective way. On the other hand, I think the main reason that Trump began originally issuing these warnings is to set up a predicate in the minds of his supporters that if he is defeated in November, it's because of massive voting fraud that resulted because of mail voting. So Trump is going to walk this very, I'll call it, intricate line over the next several weeks, warning about mail voting and fraud, so as to offer himself some potential justification to contest the election results come November and possibly December, but at the same time trying to find ways to convince his voters, his most loyal supporters, that it's okay to vote by mail. Will he be able to pull that off? One more thing I don't have the slightest ability to predict.
Okay, so on this topic of how the pandemic may or may not alter our elections moving forward, this person is wondering, do you think this election may prove that door-to-door campaigning is no longer necessary for the long term, or is this year and the virus just a pause in the use of this old technique?
Well, I suspect that it's the latter. Even if we as a society have become more comfortable and more familiar with different types of remote communication over the last several months, person-to-person, hand-to-hand, face-to-face communication, whether it's in politics or in business or with friends and family, always will always be at the core of the way we relate to each other as human beings. So I think what we will learn from this campaign is how to use online tools more effectively than campaigns ever have in the past to communicate with voters. But I think when we get to a point, whenever it is, when people can safely be engaging in person again, that face-to-face, door-to-door campaigning will once again become a central part of the campaign. We'll be better equipped and more familiar with how online campaigning can augment it, but I can't imagine a Zoom campaign replacing the in-person, the in-person infrastructure. The gamble that Biden is taking is that voters understanding the risk inherent of person-to-person campaigning will be willing to settle for the Zoom version for now, but they're still going to want to go back to the more traditional approach when circumstances do allow for it.
Great. So would the selection of a more progressive vice president, such as Elizabeth Warren, help suppress in-party rebellion after the election?
Probably not. A couple thoughts is one, while Warren is obviously very, very highly regarded by the base of the Democratic Party, I really do believe that the likelihood of her selection as Biden's running mate is a very slim one. And that's not because of whether she would be good or bad, either as a running mate or as a vice president, but rather because she represents the state of Massachusetts, which has a Republican governor. And while Charlie Baker is a very classic moderate Republican, if Senator Warren were to leave office for any reason, he, the governor, is empowered to appoint her replacement. And while Massachusetts law does require a special election to fill that seat, it'd probably take place sometime next summer, I don't know that President-elect Biden or newly sworn-in President Biden would want to start out one Senate seat down. As we all know how closely contested battle for control of the Senate is going to be this fall. Can Republicans maintain their majority, which is currently at 53 seats, or can Democrats win it back? Because by definition, Joe Biden won't know in August of 2020 how many Democratic senators he'll have should he win in January of 2021. I don't think he can afford the risk of creating one more Republican seat, even if it's just for 6 months, because it's the first 6 months, the critically important months of his presidency. aside from Warren, the other most notable progressives being considered, I think can all help Biden with turnout among the party's base in November. But generally speaking, while a vice president like Biden himself can maintain very good relationships on Capitol Hill, it's not clear that the ideological groundings of a vice president are ever going to supersede the policy goals of a president of the United States. What Biden needs in this regard is somebody who can work with Congress as effectively on his behalf as he was able to work with Congress on behalf of President Barack Obama. As he comes closer to that final decision, it'll be very, very interesting to see how much he prioritizes the ability of a running mate to develop those relationships with the other things he's considering as he comes closer to that decision.
Great. So I'll combine two questions here because they're kind of similar in terms of party or two-party system and potential realignment. So the first is a new centrist party likely with so many voters in the middle on most issues? And then another question related is, why don't the liberal socialist portion of the Democratic Party start their own liberal socialist party?
So the two major political parties in this country are not all that good at many things. The one thing they're extraordinarily talented at is maintaining their duopoly on the political system. And if you look back over the years, you've noticed that whenever an ideological movement has emerged from somewhere other than within one of the two parties, one or both of the parties has moved to co-opt it pretty quickly. I'll give you an example, and probably the most recent relevant example is the last time a somewhat plausible third candidate ran for president. And no disrespect intended toward Ralph Nader or Gary Johnson or any other third-party candidates, but I think you could agree, just in terms of number of votes cast, that Ross Perot's campaign for president of the United States in 1992 was the last time that we saw a serious challenge to the two-party nominees. And it's worth noting that although Perot ultimately ended up not winning any electoral votes, he did receive 19, almost 20% of the vote. And for many months in the spring and summer of 1992, he was actually running ahead of both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton in public opinion polls. So how did Perot do that? And what's the lesson that can be learned from that for someone who wants to challenge the two-party structure, either from the center or from the left or the right? Perot's issue was the deficit. He wanted to get rid of the deficit. And neither party, he was correct, was talking about that. After Perot was defeated, though, both parties recognized the political potency of deficit reduction in a way that they hadn't before. And so a Democratic President, Bill Clinton, proposed a budget that dramatically reduced the budget. And 2 years later, a Republican Congress under Newt Gingrich and Bob Dole worked with him to pass budgets that did dramatically reduce the deficit. So by 1996, 4 years later, when Ross Perot ran for president again, no one paid any attention to him because the issue that he had brought into the discussion had been addressed by the two parties, maybe not to the degree that he wanted, but the people who believed in deficit reduction, the voters who thought that was a critically important issue, were satisfied that they were no longer being ignored and they no longer needed him. So the way for a third party to succeed, whether in the center or on the extreme left or the extreme right, is to do it on the back of a single public policy issue, one single challenge that neither of the two parties are addressing. That's what puts that third party or that additional candidate on the map. The challenge going forward, which neither Ross Perot nor Teddy Roosevelt or any other third candidate has ever figured out a way to do, is once you put that issue on the map, how to keep the Democrats and Republicans from taking it away from you in time for the next election.
Great. Well, I think that was my last question because we are right about at the end of the hour. So I'm going to turn this back over to Kim. This was a lot of fun. So it was good asking everybody's questions.
Claire, great job today. And Christina, great job as well. Thanks to both of you for all your help. We really appreciate it.
We have such a great team here, Dan. Thank you for such a wonderful discussion again. I can't wait till we have our after discussion. So I'm going to do a pitch to you all. we get so many questions for Dan that we can't get to within an hour. We set up a special members only discussion with Dan after the webinar. So if that's something that you'd enjoy, and it's a terrific format, it's a go-to-meeting format that enables the participants to interact directly with Dan, and it's a wonderful discussion. If that's something that appeals to you, please consider becoming a member and signing up for Dan's after discussions. They're very popular, and we get to dive deep in all the questions that we couldn't get to today.
Yeah, for anyone who's tired of me just going on and on and on without interruption, the nice thing about this post-game show is it does give you a chance to be on screen, to have your voice heard, and for us to engage in discussion. And so I hope you'll consider signing up to join us for one of the future sessions.
Thank you, Dan. And for all of our viewers, if you enjoyed today's program, like we know you always do, here's how you can pledge your support. Simply text Schnur, S-C-H-N-U-R, to the number on the screen below, and this helps support our staff and keep all of the live streams going, and we very much appreciate and welcome your support. We also have a terrific lineup of programs over the summer and into the fall. Next week, in addition to Dan's regular Thursday Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, on August 11th, we have LMU University President Tim Snyder and some of his faculty experts who will be discussing the future of higher education. And then we have a conversation with House Representative Leader Kevin McCarthy on August 19th. And on August 17th, we have another members-only discussion with Dan Eberhardt, who is the CEO of Canary LLC and one of our board members, who will be discussing the status of the U.S. energy market. And then we've also been working with Dan on a new 2020 election series that starts September 8th, and it'll feature a number of phenomenal guests: Ron Brownstein from CNN in the Atlanta, General John Allen, who's the president of the Brookings Institute, Secretary of State Alex Padilla, just to name a few. We also have booked Jill Lepore coming up, and we also just confirmed Fiona Hill yesterday. So it's going to be a terrific fall. So please go to our website, become a member, pledge your support, and keep us going. Thank you all. Please stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you next week.